Okay, so this lecture is a continuation of our series, Proving or Busting Exercise Myths, and the statement that I will be addressing today is creatine supplementation always enhances exercise performance. Maybe. So, quick overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, a little bit about what exactly creatine is, how it is effective in the energy system, and then some literature on the effects of creatine supplementation for various types of anaerobic exercise, looking at aerobic capacity, different age group and genders, and then finish up with some conclusions. So, just to get us all on the same page, I wanted to just review what exactly it is that creatine is. Creatine is a non-essential dietary element, and usually we get it exogenously from fish and meat in our diet, but it's also produced endogenously primarily by the liver. Most of the creatine that is in our body is found in the skeletal muscle, and it's in one of two forms. It's either free, which you'll see on the future slides in the presentation as CR, and then in the phosphorylated form as PCR. So it's important for a very quick ATP producing system, the creatine phosphate system. So it uses that phosphorylated form of creatine to rephosphorylate ADP into ATP, and typically this happens during the very, very beginning of a power exercise or during short breaks in between high force, high power exercise. So this is a very generic version of the PCR-CR cycle. So we have our creatine phosphate that's stored in the skeletal muscle, and then it is converted using creatine kinase to creatine, and that takes the ADP to ATP, so it takes that phosphate group, reforms ATP, which is used in muscle contraction. And that system is a very costly system, which is why that's not the first, or that's the first thing that's used because it's there, but then because it's so expensive metabolically, we usually go into mitochondrial oxidation. So these are some of the different activities that are discussed in the literature. As you'll notice, a lot of this is anaerobic, very power heavy exercises. So jump squats, bench press, knee extension, hand grip. We'll also look at what the literature has to say about increasing time to fatigue or decreasing time to fatigue. Looking at performance in cycling sprints. Aerobic capacity is measured by VO2 max. Exercise performance in older adults, supplementation over a long period of time, and then what happens to body mass. So before I start in looking at this data, I want to just preface it with most of the studies that I'll talk about used a supplementation phase that was 20 to 25 grams of creatine per day. Usually that was broken up into 3 times a day, and whether they used 25 or 20, they just broke it up accordingly. Usually 3 supplementation periods, some have 4. And that, they call it a preload period, and that was typically 5 to 6 days long. So the supplementation groups in all these studies, that's what I'll be talking about. So what I have here are the results from a study that looked at performance in bench press and jump squat. And the bars here, the black bar is a pre-test, the white bar is a secondary test, and then the striped one is the third test. Now, they did kind of an interesting thing here. This was at baseline for everyone. So in all 4 of these graphs, this is at baseline. A on both of these is the control group. B is the supplementation group. The white bar is when they actually gave both groups a placebo for the first week and then retested them. And then they continued group A on the placebo and then gave group B the creatine supplement. So what we see is that there may be a little bit of a training effect here in this control group. What the sets are here, I'm sorry, this is probably really small and you can't read it. This is the bench press performance. So they did 5 sets of bench press to failure, and they counted the number of repetitions that were performed. So there was an improvement. This is statistically significant from baseline, so from T1. So there was a little bit of improvement here, statistically significant. But if we look at this, this is the supplement group, and in all 5 sets, there was a statistical significance from not only T1, but also T2. And so in between the white and the striped bar was a supplementation phase. So there was a significance in exercise performance on the bench press through all 5 sets of exercise to fatigue. This is peak power output in the jump squat, and we see something very similar here. We only see significance from baseline in the placebo group for set 2. We don't see that anywhere else, but we see significance in the supplement group, both from baseline and then from also that second test. So what this indicates is that there is an increase in the ability to produce more repetitions and peak power over a number of sets that are continued with supplementation. Another study looked at isometric knee extension and hand grip strength. And what they found was that there was a significant increase in force production with isometric knee extension after supplementation phase, but there was no statistical significance in hand grip strength. And what they suggested from this is that there may be some muscle size effect involved in whether or not creatine supplementation is effective. They suggested that larger muscles may be able to store and utilize creatine more effectively than smaller muscles, so that could explain possibly why they didn't see a difference in that hand grip strength, and they did in the knee extension. They also, in that same study, this is time to fatigue with the isometric knee extension, saw a significant difference in the time to fatigue in the supplementation group. The supplementation group is this top line noted by the circles, when the control group is the squares. And this is interesting. It was also looked at in a cycling study where they increased time to exhaustion by almost 7 seconds. And if you think about that in terms of a sprint performance of any time or a very fast performance of any type of exercise, you think about a 100-meter dash. It's over in 10 seconds if you're very good. If you can increase your ability to perform at a high level, you decrease that time to, or you increase the time to exhaustion, then you will probably have a better performance. I mean, even taking that into like a 200-meter sprint or something like that. So this is significant from a performance standpoint. So there were several studies on cycling sprints. I think it's easy because you can get a cycloergometer in your lab fairly simply. And I know this is a little bit busy, but I wanted to highlight the information that they found in this max power box. In this study, they looked at max power production in repeated cycling sprints, and they did find a significant increase in max power output in supplementation group. This study also had a very good even split between males and females. They had college-aged participants. It was fairly evenly split, and they looked to see if there was a gender effect, and there was no significant difference in power gains in the supplementation group between the males and females involved. And so this is definitely goes to affirm the myth in some aspects if people say, well, no, it won't work with women, or men are the only ones who can gain any edge in their competitive performance. No, it looks to be similar across gender. So it seems so far what we've looked at that anaerobic capacity, high force, power, activities seem to be affected positively with creatine supplementation. So this group, Van Loon and his colleagues, were interested in whether or not there's an increase in aerobic capacity. And they measured this using VO2 max. And what they found is that there were no significant differences in VO2 max, and they actually carried this study out over 42 days. So they continued the supplementation, albeit at a little bit lower dose. I'll get to it on the next slide. But over 42 days, they tested people periodically, found no increase in VO2 max. So that's kind of indicating that if you're a strictly aerobic competitor, creatine is probably not going to help you. So, myth busted there. There was another study that was done, and they wanted to see if, like a lot of things, there was an attenuated effect with age. So, okay, we seem to see that with these cycle sprint studies that there is an increase in performance, increase in power output, work done, but will this really carry over to older individuals? So they had kind of an interesting setup in their study. They had a young sedentary group, an old sedentary group, and then an old cycle-trained group. And for the old groups, they were, I think the youngest started at like 65, but in the trained group, but in the sedentary group, they were at least 70 and older. So they were a good aged population. And what they found is that the older adults who were cycle trained didn't have a significant improvement in performance, but both the young sedentary group and the old sedentary group had significant changes in their max power output and work done. So it would have been interesting to see if using the same protocol they had a young cycle trained group and see if there wasn't there was a lack of improvement similar to that old cycle trained group, but they didn't look at that. So yet again, this is a population that may not benefit from creatine supplementation. So another interesting thing that I found during my research is that there's some evidence to suggest that there are certain people just in the general population who are non-responders. They don't show an increase in muscle creatine levels with biopsies that were taken even after supplementation, usually with that heavy loading of 20 to 25 grams per day for approximately a week. There was no increase in the creatine levels in their muscle. So this is interesting if you ever look at any studies done by this. This may be a factor in attenuated results there. You may have some non-responders in your group. And consequently, there was no increased performance seen in these individuals. So that's kind of just a probably genetic factor that these people don't respond. And that could be that their muscles already hold the maximum amount of creatine that they can, or it could just be there's something else going on. So, as I stated earlier, most of the previous studies I looked at were supplementation was over about a week. This study, they wanted to know what the differences could be when it was carried over for a long period of time. And the American Academy of Sports Medicine has made a recommendation that you do with creatine supplementation 20 to 25 grams per day for a preloading phase of approximately 6 days. And then after that 6 days, decrease the supplementation amount to 2 grams per day. And there wasn't a whole lot of discussion as to why that was the recommendation. Some of it is because the side effects, I think, of creatine supplementation are still debatable. All the evidence suggests that there aren't really any negative side effects, but there's still some questions. So to protect the kidneys and things like that, just in case, then they recommend decreasing the supplementation amount. So that's what this group did. They had the creatine group and the placebo group, and they looked at, via muscle biopsy, free creatine, phosphorylated creatine, and then total, and then ATP amounts in the muscle. And what they found at day 6 was a significant increase in everything except ATP, and in the placebo group there wasn't a significant increase in the amount of creatine in any form. And then at day 42, they found that there was a significant decrease in the amounts of creatine that were found in these muscles. This was significantly different from day 0, but not significantly different from day 6. That's why this one only has the asterisk. But these are significantly different from day 6. So that kind of is, well, if you decrease the amount of supplementation, can you really expect that they're going to have the same amount of creatine in their muscle? Probably not, but they did this based on the recommendations of the ACSM and found that there wasn't a significant difference at the longer period of time. Another thing that was present in most of the studies that looked at creatine supplementation was a marked increase in body mass. There's been some discussion as to whether or not this increase in body mass comes from water retention, but there have been several studies that looked at the water content of muscle, and there's really no evidence to suggest that that's what is causing the increase in body mass. But there was a range of mass increase from about 1.5 kilograms up to 3.5 kilograms. It's kind of the average range. So when we talk about increase in exercise performance, sometimes an increase in body mass is good, and sometimes an increase in body mass can be detrimental. So we have our linemen here at practice. If any of them increase their body mass by 3.5 kilograms, that's good, because they're going to be more movable. They're going to most likely have more power, or the ability to create more power there, which is good, and that's their entire job. We look at this ballerina, and so we take any sort of dance, but I like this picture specifically because if we look at the way that she's supporting herself, she is supporting herself entirely on point. So all of the ground reaction forces that are being produced there are going straight up through her toes. So if she was to gain, even on the low end, 1 to 1.5 kilograms of extra body mass, that's going to increase the ground reaction forces that are felt there because of Newton's law. You have the equal and opposite forces. So that could be detrimental to her bone structure, her ability to perform her job, and dance is a very aesthetic sport. So she could lose her job if the directors of her company no longer like the way that she looks. Unfortunately, that's the truth. And then we have Gabby Douglas over here, who obviously has the ability to produce great amounts of force, power. She's very small, though. So, and that's one of the things that makes a very good gymnast is they're very small, but they have a high force to body mass ratio. So if she gains body mass, especially over the short amount of time that was shown in these studies, because if the supplementation period was only 6 days and this increase of up to 3.5 kilograms of extra body mass was gained in that amount of time, if she was able to do that, how would that affect her proprioceptively? Would she be able to continue to perform these routines that she's worked on for months and years as effectively as she has if she's dealing with a little bit more body mass? So that's kind of something to think about. It's like good for these guys, definitely not good for her, and probably not beneficial for her. So in conclusion, creatine supplementation did improve exercise performance for some types of exercise. Power activities saw the most improvement. You have your football players, your weightlifters, your cycling sprints, anything like that. But if you're strictly an aerobic athlete, this may not be the way that you want to invest your time, your money, your training. So, in conclusion, this myth is busted because it did state that it always improves exercise performance. So, kind of takes us back to grade school. We're learning how to take any sort of test. Be skeptical if you see always or never statements. And make sure that you always, and yes, I am using that purposefully, read literature carefully. Just because they're making a statement doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. Always look at their data. Any questions?
So if you can obtain these creatine in foods like steak and fish, what's the usual intake by the average person who eats red meat or fish?
I'm not sure. There wasn't really, I didn't see that in any of the literature. It's just like, oh, this is an exogenous way that we get this. But it's definitely less than the 20 to 25 grams per day. I'm not really sure.
So, like, in those studies where you saw improved performance, okay, were they always training, or were they all sedentary people? Because one of the aspects of creatine is that, you know, you have more fuel on board so you can train harder, and that's why you see the improvement. So was that what was happening in your studies, or were these just mostly sedentary people, or?
It was kind of a mixed bag. There were, I mean, throughout all of these studies, people looked at it differently. There were, I would say the majority of them took people from the already active population and supplemented them, but there were...
So like your strength study, I mean, they just, and obviously it was like 6 days they were on creatine. That's what, it wasn't ever very long.
Yeah.
So it couldn't have been a training effect. It had to be a creatine supplementation.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what they did, and they kind of either stopped people from doing any sort of activity. I know that's what they did in several of the studies that looked at the cycling sprints. They told them to stop training during that period if they were, and then others, they had them just continue what they had been doing, which may be a compounding factor if they were still training. But most of them looked at, I won't say most, there were probably about half and half that looked at the trained versus untrained.
And in the older people, you said that it showed it in the sedentary individuals, and what did it increase? I forget.
Max power output, and then work.
That in events lasting how long?
I'm going to say 30 seconds.
Okay, makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, some did in time increments, some did at a percentage of their max.
Did you come across any studies that looked at increasing the activity of creatine kinase directly? I guess that's probably more an animal study, but...
Yeah, no, everything that I looked at was exercise performance, so I didn't really get into creatine kinase. It was interesting. Some people had, there were a couple of studies that really wanted to say that it increased aerobic capacity. There was this study, they looked at an alternate intensity cycling. So it's like, oh, cycling is typically an aerobic activity. If we see an increase in these people, then that will be increased aerobic capacity. But they had people alternating between 30% of their maximal effort and 90% of their maximal effort. It's like, oh, we saw an improvement, so that must mean that aerobically they're better off. It's like, well, if you're doing something that lasts for less than 3 minutes, you alternate, you're probably not looking at aerobic capacity here.
Yeah, but that functionally or performance-wise, that could be extremely important because cyclists, even runners, they have to fight off the pack, or they have that burst at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering that might be beneficial for those 10, 15-second bursts that they have to sustain.
Well, it seemed like from what I was reading that most of the benefit was seen if there was a short break in between activities. So there was a greater capacity, like in the jump squat or bench press data that I put up. It was okay in the non-supplementation group. It's like on our first set we got to here, and then we got a little bit of a break. Well, they didn't really come back down to here because they weren't able to rephosphorylate all the ADP. So they kind of start from here, energy-wise, and then they go, even if they could get up to exactly the same amount, they're still at that decrease. But it was really during that break time that is when that rephosphorylation was happening. And so just because there was more of the creatine phosphate available in the muscle to go through that cycle, then, so it's like, okay, if you're doing a cycling event or a running event that is continuous, are you still going to get that benefit at the end? Because maybe not. I doubt it, because you've already kind of gone through that few seconds really that you have of the PCR-CR cycle at the beginning with the onset of exercise, and then you move into aerobic respiration.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
That is, in the literature that you read, were there similarities with glycogen loading? You can't glycogen load months upon months. You have to do it, maybe 2-3 times a year for the chosen events you want to excel in. Do you think that same phenomenon occurs with the creatine supplementation? You have sort of, which major events are you really going to want to address?
I would actually say no.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that would be the case. There's some pretty strong indications from a couple of the articles that I read that your body actually decreases its production of creatine whenever you are supplementing at high levels. So, but if you stop, it kind of evens out, so you kind of get back to your baseline. But if you continue to supplement, then that will still just be present in your muscle. But as you decrease the supplementation, like over that long period of time, you decrease. So I would be interested to see more studies that carried it out over a long period of time at the same level, but seem to indicate that as long as you're supplementing, your body's going to just kind of take advantage of packing as much into your skeletal muscle as it can, but you're not endogenously going to be producing it anymore.
So if you become dependent on the outside source.
Yeah, and then you have to have kind of a recalibration phase, if you will, after you're finished.
All right, very good. Yeah, well, Patrick's getting ready. Sorry if there was any confusion about the time today, but yeah, we'll always meet at 11, and yeah, the room opened up, which was why there was some initial controversy at the beginning, but yeah, we'll always have it at 11
All right. Okay, so I'm talking about the myth that you can turn fat into muscle through exercise. So So this myth, I mean, from what I see, it seems to be dying off a little bit, which is a good thing because, well, this is a Mythbuster, so you all know it's a myth. But it took me a little bit more time to actually find people who support this and actively teach this. But there's some reason behind it why this myth originated. I mean, I first heard it, like, is it possible to turn your fat into muscle through exercise? I first heard this when I was in high school during football season from all my football coaches and trainers. Their mentality is you need to bulk up during the off season, so put on as much, they said seafood diet, seafood eat it. So you eat as much as you can during the off season and just put on tons of weight so you can turn it into muscle during the preseason. That was the mentality. So it's no wonder why we only won 1 game a year. And then also, I mean, I found this from an online fitness instructor. He said certain types of fat are perfect for building muscle. He says, I personally eat a scoop of fat 30 minutes before every workout.
What?
He said it was coconut oil, and oil is a fat, so you take a scoop of coconut oil, but it's still out there. And there's some, visual evidence, before you start an exercise program, you've got some adiposity, some fat that you can turn into muscle, or it appears that you turn it into muscle. So that's kind of where it originates, and that's kind of what brings us is this kind of inverse relationship of fat and muscle in exercise. And it's a loose relationship, but we'll explain it here. There's 2 studies. Here, this is a 12-week program here. And they had 4 groups. They had a control group, which didn't change anything, a group that did diet alone, a group that did diet and endurance type exercise, so the E is for endurance, and then a group that did diet, endurance exercise, and strength training, or resistance exercise. And so what they saw over these 12 weeks is that all the groups that either dieted, or we're focusing mainly on the exercise here, that if you did endurance or also endurance and strength training, you decreased your body mass, your overall body mass. These people lost between 8 and 10 kilos of body mass over 12 weeks. That's a pretty good loss. So, but when they looked at where this body mass loss was coming from, they saw that these groups, the endurance training group and the strength training group, lost a lot, also the diet group, but they lost a lot of fat mass. So a lot of this loss came from fat. So they lost their fat, and then we looked at their fat-free mass, their lean tissues, the muscle particularly. They noticed that they didn't really lose their muscle. There's a tendency to lose them in the diet group and in the endurance group, but the strength group, they tended to maintain their muscle mass. Here's another study where they looked at, this study took place in older adults, older men, and they had a training group and a control group again, and they just looked specifically at strength training only, not endurance exercise. And what they saw is through 12 weeks of training that they looked at their fat mass here. Through 12 weeks of training, they lost significantly some of their fat mass. Now, it doesn't look huge here because the scale is compared to the whole body, but it was significant that they lost a significant portion of their fat mass. And their lean mass, mainly their muscle mass, they were able to increase this significantly. So they lost their fat, increased their muscle. So during exercise, you think, okay, I'm losing my fat mass, I'm increasing slightly, or I'm maintaining my muscle mass. So where does the fat go? And you think, oh, the fat must turn into muscle. So that's kind of the visual evidence of how this myth oriented. So if we're going to be turning fat into muscle, well, let's see what muscle really is and see if this is even possible. So when you see muscle, you think of muscle as mainly this kind of big bulky bodybuilder here, but muscle is a highly complex organ, and there's 3 types of muscles in the body. You have cardiac muscle, and the name implies that it's located only in the heart. So cardiac muscle is really only in the heart. Smooth muscle, which is not voluntarily controlled at all. And that's located in your digestive tract and also in your vasculature, in your blood vessels. And then you have your skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is by far the most bulk of your muscle in your body. And that's what we care about. That's what everyone wants to increase their muscle mass. There's no reason for that. So muscle itself, skeletal muscle is what produces the movement of the body. It allows for respiration. That's how you inhale, exhale, and it's also what a lot of bodybuilders try to maximize. The little Arnold Schwarzenegger here back in the day. So, okay, but as we look more at the muscle structure and kind of what muscle really is and how it's made up to see what the components are and the building blocks of muscle, we see that muscle has a really organized structure here. We've got this whole muscle here organized into bundles of cells, and these bundles are called fascicles. And each fascicle is made up of a bunch of muscle fibers. And a muscle fiber is a single muscle cell. And inside each muscle cell, each muscle fiber, are all these myofilaments, myofibrils. These proteins, they're called contractile proteins, mainly actin and myosin are the two proteins that consist of these myofibrils. And we'll get into those in a little bit here, but muscle has a very high protein content. So all these filaments here and a lot of other things throughout the muscle are composed of protein. And proteins are made up of amino acids. And so a protein, doesn't matter what type of protein it is, there's thousands of different types of proteins in the body. They're all made from amino acids. And they have this primary structure, so a linkage, this chain of amino acids, which will fold together to adopt secondary and tertiary structure. And the pattern that it folds into dictates the function of the protein. So we've got all these proteins in these muscles. They're used to produce force. So how do the muscles produce force from these proteins? And mainly they produce force is through these proteins, that contractile filaments called actin and myosin. So what we have here are these blue proteins here. This filament here is the myosin filament. And each filament is made up of about 200 to 300 myosin proteins, so individual myosin proteins. And then you've got all these actin proteins, these actin filaments here, which are made up of two actin filaments that are intertwined, as you can see up here. And so the muscles produce force through these myosin filaments. They have these little heads down here that act like ratchets. These things will attach to the actin filaments. They go through what we call a power stroke, where they use energy to do this. And they ratchet these actin filaments towards the center of the myosin filament. When they do that, they shorten the whole muscle. And that's how they produce force. Now, these are all proteins in the muscle, and myosin is also known as a thick filament because it's a very heavy and very large protein. And in fact, myosin itself makes up 2/3 of all protein in the muscle. So most muscle protein is myosin itself. Okay, so that's kind of the building blocks of muscle. You have a lot of protein, tons of actin and myosin, which are the actual proteins that produce force. And so, now, how do you make more muscle? The short answer is to make more protein. So, but here's a couple of studies here. Everyone goes, you want to get stronger, you want to make more muscle, you go to the gym, you lift weights, you exercise, because everyone knows that works. And how it works? Well, here's a study. They showed, again, 12 weeks of training, resistance training, and endurance training. So the endurance training group here and a resistance training group here. And after 12 weeks of training, we have pre and post measurements here. They've looked at their knee extension and hamstring curls for maximum, their max strength. They did a 3-repetition maximum to determine that. And you can see that the endurance training group, in both measurements, increases their strength. They also measured, they took biopsies of these people before and after, and they measured the cross-sectional area of the muscle fibers. And what they saw is that in the resistance training group, that the cross-sectional area of the fibers increases. And endurance group, they tended to increase but didn't reach significance. So you increase the cross-sectional area of your fibers. And that's a different study here. What they did is, this took place in mice, and they did this procedure called the synergist ablation. So in the lower leg, they cut away and dissect the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles, leaving only the plantaris muscle to support the weight of what 3 muscles normally do. So this muscle, the plantaris, is constantly being weight trained. It's constantly being overloaded. So what happens is here you have the sham operated muscle, so they did a surgery but didn't touch anything. This muscle is much smaller compared to this plantaris, so the synergist ablated muscle. So this one was overworked constantly, or this one was not overworked. And you can see this muscle is huge compared to this one. Now you look at the cross-sectional area of every single muscle fiber inside of here, and all the fibers, type 1, 2A, 2X, 2B, all the fibers are have a greater cross-sectional area in the muscle that went, the synergist ablated muscle, the plantaris. This stain here, the pure myosin grayscale stain here, is actually kind of a heat map for protein synthesis. And so where you see these bright spots, the lighter color, is indicative of a higher amount of protein synthesis. So what you can see is that in the muscle that was being overloaded, the synergist ablated muscle, it has a higher rate of protein synthesis going on compared to the one that was not overloaded. And they actually quantify this based on fiber type here, that you have protein synthesis rates of 70% up to 120% greater in the muscle that's being worked out more often. So to increase your muscle, increase your muscle strength, you need to increase protein synthesis, particularly of those contractile filaments, actin and myosin. So this is a pretty awesome electron micrograph of cross-sectional area of those skeletal muscle. What you can see is the thick filament here, these dark circles, the myosin filament, and then all the actin that surrounds it, the actin filaments. And as you can imagine, as you start doing strength training, you start synthesizing more of these proteins, that muscle fiber is going to get bigger. If you do that with all your fibers, the whole muscle itself is going to get bigger. And if you have more of these filaments, you're going to be able to actually produce more strength. So that's the process of muscle hypertrophy. And the building blocks of muscle are really these proteins, and primarily since it's such a huge component of muscle, the actin and myosin. Okay, so on the converse side is what is fat? Fat is also known, there's synonyms, lard, oil, wax, lipid are also some other synonyms for for fat. Slight different connotations, but in general, fats do not mix with water, and they're generally soluble in organic solvents. And fat really is energy. It is a fuel. And if you don't believe me, stick a wick in a can of Crisco and light it on fire, and it actually produces, it's just like a candle. It has a fuel that you can burn. And I imagine that can will burn for quite some time. So fat itself is a very energy dense fuel. You get 9 calories of energy for every gram of fat. Compared to protein and carbohydrate, you get about 4 calories for every gram. Okay. So how do we, what is fat made of? The fat that we see, that people carry, is carried in tissue called adipose tissue. And what we have here is someone who weighs 250 pounds and 120 pounds. And these are MRI scans of their body. And what you can see is the white stuff around the periphery is adipose tissue. This is subcutaneous fat. And around the gut is called visceral fat. The person that weighs a lot more has a lot more storage of this fat in this adipose tissue compared to the person who weighs 120 pounds. Okay, as we look at the adipose tissue itself, the cells themselves are, adipose tissue cells are adipocytes. And these cells are highly specialized cells which specialize in really storing fat. And the way that they store fat is in this molecule called a triglyceride. So inside of this adipocyte you have is packed full of triglycerides. The triglycerides themselves are composed of 3 of these fatty acid molecules, and they come in a variety of lengths and different shapes depending on their chemical structure. And so you have 3 of these fatty acid molecules that are bound to a glycerol backbone here, and that's what forms triglyceride. So that's kind of how do we store fat. From our diet, we eat fat, and into the blood we absorb our free fatty acids. Okay, they they will get transported from the blood to the adipose tissue, where they're taken up by the adipocytes. And once in the adipocytes, they get synthesized and made into a triglyceride. So they get attached to a glycerol backbone, make a triglyceride, and as you start to increase your synthesis of these triglycerides into the adipose tissue, this adipocyte will actually expand in size, and as you expand in size, you actually expand in your adipose tissue and your fat storage. So that's how we store fat, okay? Now, how do we use fat? Because we want to turn our fat into muscle, right? So how are we going to use this fat? So a few people have found a clever way to use fat. You can make a nice table out of it if you want to, okay? But I guess to clarify, how do we use fat to produce energy? So again, we've got this adipocyte that are full of triglycerides. And when there's an energy demand, so if during exercise or even right now we're using some of our, our fat stores to fuel our basal metabolism. So what we see is these triglycerides are broken down to free fatty acids, which will enter the bloodstream, travel to the muscle, where they're taken up by the muscle. Once we're inside the muscle, this free fatty acid is going to undergo several chemical modifications. The first part is called beta oxidation. And during this process, the free fatty acid molecule is going to get activated, so we're going to actually join a molecule called coenzyme A, or CoA, to this fatty acid. And it's going to go through a series of modifications, but in the end, what we're going to end up with is a molecule of acetyl-CoA. And if you notice here, this fatty acid is several carbons long. So say we got 16 carbons on a fatty acid. These two here, at the end of the process, are going to get lopped off. So we're chopping off 2 carbons at a time. And then we have our shortened fatty acid molecule remaining. So we have 2 carbons in this acetyl-CoA molecule that are going to go to the citric acid cycle. And in this cycle, we take a molecule of oxaloacetate, and it joins up with a molecule of acetyl-CoA. So we have a 4-carbon molecule joining with a 2-carbon molecule, and that forms citrate, our 6-carbon molecule. And this cycle is really just a cycle. It will go through these reactions as long as there's substrate available for it. But along the way, we're going to produce a few byproducts. So as we go through this cycle here, we're actually going to lose our carbons. So we're going to lose 2 carbons, and that's going to be in the form of carbon dioxide. So as we go through this conversion, we lose a carbon dioxide here, we lose carbon dioxide here. We're also going to produce some other molecules. We're going to produce a molecule of ATP. First it's GTP, but that's rapidly converted to ATP. And then these NADH and FADH2s. So what have we made at the end of breaking down this carbon chain, this fatty acid? Well, we've made CO2, we've made ATP, and we've made 3 molecules of NADH and 1 of FADH2. And these molecules here are really just, they're like shuttles. They transport electrons to the electron transport chain and the hydrogens along with it, just in the same way the shuttle will transport astronauts to the space station. So then we have these products that we've made so far. The NADH and the FADH2, like I just said, they're going to take these electrons and hydrogens to the electron transport chain, transfer these, where in the end, we're going to produce a molecule of water, and we're going to synthesize ATP. So what's left over after the total breakdown and use of this fatty acid molecule? We get a molecule of water, we get some carbon dioxide, and we get a bunch of ATP. We get a bunch of energy. Okay? So are any of those turned into muscle, is what you're asking. That's what we've got left. Can we turn that into muscle? Well, if you remember our structure of our muscle, muscle is composed of mainly these proteins acting in myosin, at least the strength components we're really concerned about. And those proteins are made of amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. And the amino acids, in short, you can't make amino acids from carbon dioxide and water. So to make that answer short, no. The carbon dioxide that you produce by beta oxidation and the citric acid cycle is going to be exhaled to the environment. It's going to enter the bloodstream, travel to your lungs, where you're just going to breathe it out. Okay, now water can diffuse very easily in and out of that muscle cell to anywhere it needs to go into the body. So those are not going to be, you just can't turn any of those into an amino acid for protein synthesis. So really, the adipose tissue and skeletal muscle are completely different tissues. They're, as you can say, apples and oranges. And to make an analogy, gasoline is a fuel in the same way that fat is a fuel. You can put gasoline into your car and into your tank and you can store it, and the engine of your car can take that fuel, and the engine's like your muscle, take that fuel to produce energy or to produce movement or whatever you need to do. But when you put gasoline in your car, that gasoline is never going to become part of your engine. So it doesn't happen. So no matter how hard you try to exercise that fat, it's just not going to turn into muscle. Okay, so it's a fuel, but it can't become the muscle itself. Okay, any questions?
I think if your football team had guys your side, there's probably another reason that you won one game. Not just the fat and the
Yeah, I did put on
play.
20 pounds once I started doing creatine supplementation. So, my sophomore year.
All right.
What about the other way around? Can muscle be turned into fat?
That's a good question. So muscle, since it's primarily protein, you've got these building blocks of amino acids. And that's the converse of it, is if you build up a lot of muscle, you sit around for months, and you're going to turn that into fat, because there seems to be a visual appearance that you stop working out, you start putting on more fat. But when the muscle is broken down, it's broken down, if you're not using it, proteins have a certain half-life. So if every protein will only last so long before it's just spontaneously degraded. Okay, so if you're not actively making new proteins, so if you're not actively synthesizing it, like that picture I showed of the cross scale that had that heat map, if you're not actively synthesizing proteins, eventually you're going to start losing some of those proteins. And proteins, depending on what amino acids are degraded and locked off, there's lots of different ways that they can be handled, depending on their structure. The common entry point is that molecule acetyl-CoA. So as you start to degrade your muscle, if you're not using it and it's being degraded, the amino acids can actually get broken down to acetyl-CoA. And under the certain state that you're in, it's called a state of catabolism, there's an energy demand, not an energy surplus. So you're breaking them down, and these proteins, the acetyl-CoA, is going to enter the citric acid cycle, where it's going to be used to produce carbon dioxide, NADH, and ATP to energy. So you're going to use it to produce energy. It's not going to be turned around to synthesize fat. So the protein, your muscle protein won't be actually turned into fat. It'll be used to supply energy to fuel your basal metabolism.
Anything else? All right. Okay, very good. Okay, so 11 o'clock next Thursday. All right, and also it'll be a little bit busy too. I think I put down the wrong room number. It's supposed to be this room where Dr. Goodpaster will present at 9 o'clock if you can make it. He's a pretty good collaborator of ours that is going to also look at skeletal muscle a lot with the gastric bypass patients and so forth. So, okay, so we'll see you next Wednesday.
Is that insane?